A flight attendant slipped poison into the black CEO's drink. Minutes later, the executive was vomiting blood and collapsing in his seat, and what happened mid-air will shock you to the core. He smiled as he passed the glass, never expecting the cabin to turn against him. Subscribe if you believe no uniform erases a crime. Complimentary drink, sir? The voice came smooth and polite, barely rising above the soft hum of Halvex Airlines Flight 3702. Elijah Cross looked up from his leather-bound folder, blinking against the golden sunlight that streamed through the aircraft window. He had been buried in contract revisions, double-checking a few figures before his meeting in Vondale City. Adjusting his cufflinks, he offered a nod, calm as ever. "Just water, please." Flight attendant Connor Vale smiled, a little too tightly. His white-gloved hand took the order with practiced elegance, but the stiffness in his jaw betrayed something deeper, something far more bitter than the pleasant tone he had delivered. He turned swiftly and strode back toward the galley, heels tapping crisply against the aisle's carpeted floor. His face twitched once out of sight, tension crawling beneath his skin like heat under a collar. With a slow, mechanical motion, Connor reached into the pocket of his pressed navy slacks and retrieved a narrow glass vial. The liquid inside shimmered faintly under the overhead lights, nearly clear, deceptively harmless. He unscrewed the cap from a sealed water bottle and let the vial's contents drip silently into the mouth of the cap. He paused, listening to the subtle sounds of the aircraft, the rhythmic hum of engines, the murmur of casual conversation, the faint rustle of newspapers and plastic wrappers. No one was watching, or, if they were, no one cared. Connor twisted the cap shut with a controlled breath and wiped his fingers with a nearby napkin. As he straightened, his reflection flickered faintly in the galley's chrome paneling. A clean-cut man in his mid-30s looked back at him. Sharp cheekbones, tidy, side-parted hair, the kind of face people trusted at 35,000 feet. But behind the blue eyes, a storm festered. He walked back down the aisle, water in hand, steady and composed. Row 3 came quickly. Elijah looked up again, this time with a brief smile, his posture relaxed yet regal. He had the bearing of someone used to boardrooms and spotlights, the quiet confidence of a man who had earned every rung of the ladder. "Here you are, sir," Connor said, placing the water gently on Elijah's tray table. Their eyes met briefly. Connor's gaze was unreadable. "Thank you," Elijah replied, nodding again, then turning back to his notes. Connor didn't move right away. For just a breath, he lingered, watching, observing. When Elijah finally reached for the bottle and took a sip, Connor's expression flickered with something close to satisfaction. He turned away without a word. The sun shifted slightly outside the window, casting a longer shadow across Elijah's arm. He didn't notice. His mind was deep in figures, transport infrastructure estimates, deployment timelines, quarterly projections. This meeting was supposed to mark the final green light. After months of negotiations, the Department of Infrastructure was ready to commit. Savantis Dynamics, his company, would oversee the largest smart grid expansion in the Eastern Corridor. It was a career-defining milestone. He sipped again, unaware of the tiny betrayal swirling in the bottle. Back in the galley, Connor leaned against the side panel, feigning a casual stance as he folded his arms. But his fingers tapped against his forearm. Not nervously, rhythmically, as if keeping time. Elijah's hand paused for a moment over the folder. A slight wave of discomfort stirred in his gut. He shifted in his seat, rolled his neck, and blinked hard. The turbulence had been light so far, barely a whisper, but a strange warmth was building in his chest. He glanced toward the aisle and spotted the flight attendant chatting quietly with another passenger, smiling again. Polished. Perfect. The ache grew sharper. Elijah shook his head slightly and inhaled. Maybe it was nerves. Stress, even. He hadn't eaten since morning. Maybe the coffee from the lounge had triggered his acid reflux. He took another sip of water, hoping to calm it. Across the aisle, an older man glanced over. He wore a blue sweater vest and had the kind eyes of someone who'd spent years learning to read faces. He saw the shift, the furrow in Elijah's brow, the growing stiffness in his posture. "You all right, son?" he asked, voice low but kind. Elijah tried to smile but nodded a bit too fast. "Just a little off," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "Long week?" The man nodded sympathetically and turned back to his crossword. Elijah tried to focus, but something was wrong. He couldn't place it exactly. The room felt warmer. Too warm. His vision flickered briefly like someone had dimmed the lights. Sweat began to prick at his temple. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for a pen, barely, but enough for him to notice. In the galley, Connor watched from the edge of the curtain, peeking through with an expression of false concern. Elijah exhaled, deeper this time. He rubbed his chest, then his stomach. His pulse was rising, fast and shallow. He blinked again, twice, then shook his head, confused. Was this a panic attack? Number. He had delivered speeches to Senate committees, faced down billion-dollar merger panels. This wasn't panic. This felt poisoned. The realization came not as a thought, but as a tightening coil in his gut. He looked down at the water bottle, now half empty, and the world tilted slightly. His chest clenched. He tried to stand, but his knees buckled. The tray table snapped upward as his elbow struck it. Elijah collapsed sideways into the aisle, knocking his briefcase to the floor. A chorus of gasps filled the cabin. A woman screamed. The man in the sweater vest rushed from his seat and caught Elijah's head just before it struck the floor. "Help!" the man shouted. "Somebody help! He's not breathing right!" Passengers leaned into the aisle. A man fumbled for the flight attendant button. Another began dialing on his phone, forgetting there was no service. Connor stepped forward with practiced urgency, kneeling beside Elijah. But his hands didn't move. His eyes flicked over the scene, Elijah's convulsing body, the blood now beginning to seep from the corner of his mouth, the panic rising in every voice, and he tilted his head with mock confusion. "Is there a doctor on board?" someone yelled. Connor didn't answer. He stood again, backing away slowly as others pushed forward. His expression was blank now, void of emotion, like someone observing a fire he didn't start but wouldn't put out. "He was just fine a moment ago," said the older man, kneeling next to Elijah, voice trembling. Connor turned without a word and disappeared behind the galley curtain. Elijah twitched once on the floor, red foam flecking his lips. He gasped, eyes wide, trying to speak. His hand reached weakly toward the aisle, but nothing came out, and all the while the poisoned water bottle lay quietly on the floor, rolling slowly with the motion of the aircraft, its cap slightly smudged. "Enjoy your flight," Connor had said as he handed it over. "Some journeys are meant to end differently." Elijah's hand jerked suddenly, the water bottle slipping from his grasp and tumbling to the floor with a muted thud. A sharp, invisible spike of pain twisted deep in his gut like a hot coil, winding tighter with every breath. He clenched his jaw, forcing his focus back to the glowing tablet on his lap. The letters blurred, the lines of his presentation notes melting into each other. He blinked hard. Something was wrong. A subtle nausea rolled through him. He shifted in his seat, adjusting his posture to ease the discomfort. Maybe it was turbulence. He'd flown enough to know the feeling. He inhaled through his nose, steadying himself, but the air felt different, heavier, like it was pressing down on his chest. His skin prickled with a cold sweat that pooled under the collar of his tailored shirt. Beside him, in 3B, Franklin Pierce, a retired engineer with the kind eyes of a man who'd seen too much and said too little, glanced over. He noticed Elijah's stiff movements, the slight tremor in his fingers. "You all right, son?" Franklin asked, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small metal tin. "Ginger mint. Helps with air sickness." Elijah looked at him, trying to form words. He forced a faint smile and shook his head. "Thank you," he murmured, voice raspier than he remembered it being. "Just need a moment." Franklin didn't press, but he didn't look away either. At the rear of the cabin, Connor Vale leaned against the galley wall, arms folded as he observed the unfolding scene with chilling stillness. His eyes locked onto Elijah's every movement, his expression unreadable. He tilted his head slightly as if mentally checking boxes. Elijah reached down for his briefcase, hoping that focusing on the act, something routine, something normal, would anchor him. But his hand missed the latch entirely. His fingers trembled uncontrollably, knocking against the edge. He inhaled sharply, then winced. His stomach twisted again, this time sharper, angrier. A metallic taste rose in his mouth. He brought a hand to his lips, but it was too late. A single dark bead of blood escaped from the corner and slid down his chin. Then another. The motion caught Franklin's eye instantly. "Elijah," he said sharply, sitting forward. Elijah tried to speak but couldn't. His tongue felt thick, like it no longer belonged to him. A wave of dizziness crashed over him, stealing his balance as he pushed up from his seat. He took one unsteady step into the aisle and crumpled. Gasps filled the cabin. A woman 2 rows back shrieked. The overhead bins shuddered as passengers leaned out to look. Franklin sprang into action, catching Elijah's head before it struck the floor. He cradled it gently, the blood from Elijah's lips staining the cuff of his shirt. "He's bleeding," Franklin shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. "He needs help." The flight attendants froze. Then the intercom snapped on. "Is there a doctor on board?" a male voice asked, urgent but strained. Connor didn't move. He stood just beyond the beverage cart, his hands resting on the edge, knuckles pale. His lips parted slightly, a manufactured look of shock spreading slowly across his face. His gaze never left Elijah's body. "Elijah, stay with me," Franklin urged. "Talk to me." Elijah's eyes fluttered, lids heavy. His body jerked once, then again. Crimson spittle bubbled at the corners of his mouth. He clutched at Franklin's sleeve with trembling fingers, but the grip was weak. "I saw him just minutes ago," another passenger said, bewildered. "He looked completely fine." Jeremy, the young attendant stationed in coach, moved down the aisle quickly. "Make room," he called. He dropped to his knees beside Elijah, glancing up at Franklin. "What happened?" "I don't know," Franklin replied, voice tight. "He collapsed. He's bleeding. Fast." Elijah's back arched slightly before dropping limp again. His eyes rolled, unfocused, lips quivering with the effort to speak. From the corner of his eye, Franklin saw Connor still standing there, motionless. The way he stared, not in confusion but in calculation, sent a chill through the older man's spine. "Elijah," Franklin said again, voice softer now, almost pleading. "Stay awake. Help's coming." A low sound rasped from Elijah's throat, a gurgle wrapped in pain. He tried again. His fingers moved like they were writing in the air, twitching against the carpet. Connor blinked slowly, then finally stepped forward, speaking to no one in particular. "He was just fine a moment ago." Jeremy frowned at him. "Can you help me get the med kit?" Connor nodded a beat too late. "Of course." But Franklin wasn't watching Jeremy anymore. His eyes followed Connor's path with quiet suspicion. Something about the man's reaction, the timing, the stillness, didn't sit right. Not at all. Below them, the aircraft continued its smooth trajectory eastward. But inside the cabin, the atmosphere was spiraling into chaos. People whispered, leaned across seats, stared. A child whimpered behind row 5. A business traveler shut his laptop slowly, his focus drawn entirely to the scene unraveling just feet away. Franklin pressed 2 fingers to Elijah's neck, searching for a pulse. It was there, faint, erratic. "Call for help," he barked over his shoulder. "Something's wrong. Something's very wrong." Elijah Cross collapsed. The sharp thud of his knees hitting the aisle floor cut through the quiet murmur of Flight 3702 like a gunshot. His body convulsed, and his left hand flailed briefly before landing awkwardly against the leather seat armrest. His right hand, still clutching his briefcase, released it with a clatter as he crumpled fully, his back arching, a low, strangled gasp escaping his throat. Passengers nearby jolted upright, startled. A few craned their necks, while others stood abruptly, phones already in hand, unsure whether to record, call for help, or simply stare. In seat 3B, Franklin Mays, a retired engineer with calm instincts honed from years of troubleshooting critical systems, leaned down without hesitation. His knees cracked as he dropped beside Elijah, catching his head just before it hit the carpeted floor. Hey, sir, can you hear me?" Franklin called out, his voice urgent but controlled. Elijah's eyes fluttered, his pupils dilated and wild. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth, thin at first, then thicker. "Oh no," Franklin muttered, easing Elijah onto his side. "Somebody call for help." A flight attendant sprinted down the aisle. Not Connor, he was nowhere in sight, but another young crewman named Jeremy. Jeremy fumbled with the intercom, voice shaking as he spoke into it. "We have a medical emergency in row 3. If there is a doctor on board, please report to the front of the cabin immediately." In coach, a man in his mid-50s stood up quickly, flashing a silver badge pinned to his lapel. "Dr. Nathan Royce," he called, stepping past startled passengers. A few moved aside and he moved down the aisle with efficient urgency, clutching a compact red first aid bag. By the time Dr. Royce knelt beside Elijah, the man's breathing was erratic. His skin had turned a ghostly shade, his forehead slick with sweat, and his lips tinged blue. Franklin looked up at the doctor, his brow creased with worry. He was fine 5 minutes ago. Franklin said. Then he just dropped. I think he tried to say something. Dr. Royce began assessing vitals with quick, practiced motions, checking pulse, lifting an eyelid, feeling for resistance in the neck. His heart rate is shallow, very shallow, he muttered. This isn't altitude-related? He glanced over to the nearby tray where a water bottle sat uncapped, drops still clinging to the rim. He picked it up and sniffed it, frowning. This smells off. Slightly metallic. Turning to a flight attendant who had arrived moments earlier, he said, "Get this to the co-pilot. Tell him to flag it for testing. Immediately." The co-pilot, already assisting in cockpit emergency coordination, received the bottle with wide eyes. "On it," he said, and disappeared behind the cockpit door. Meanwhile, in the rear galley, Connor Vale stood before the mirror above the sink, hands slick with soap. His reflection stared back at him, calm, composed, but his fingers betrayed him, twitching as he scrubbed the residue from his palms. He reached into his jacket, retrieving the tiny empty vial, and carefully rolled it inside a napkin. With a swift move, he pulled off his left shoe and shoved the vial into his sock, adjusting it to lie flat against his ankle. The door creaked behind him. Connor spun, masking his surprise. Jeremy stood there, still slightly out of breath, eyes wide. "You okay?" he asked, eyeing Connor's shaking hands. Connor blinked, wiped his hands dry on a towel, and flashed a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just adrenaline," he replied smoothly. "That man up front, he's crashing. Hard to stay calm, you know?" Jeremy gave a hesitant nod, but something in his expression remained uncertain. "Yeah, I guess so." Back in the cabin, Elijah twitched violently. His body jolted, a harsh cough erupting from his throat, spraying specks of blood onto Franklin's forearm. "He's trying to say something," Franklin said, leaning close. Elijah's hand reached out weakly, fumbling until it gripped the sleeve of Franklin's jacket. His eyes were glassy but frantic, his chest heaving as though every breath was a mountain to climb. He parted his lips, and through a rasp that barely qualified as sound, he spoke. "He meant to." The words slipped out like dying embers. Elijah's grip loosened. His eyes rolled back. "Stay with me," Franklin urged, gripping his shoulder, but Elijah's body went still. The passengers around them froze, unsure what they'd just heard, or if they were supposed to understand it at all. But Franklin heard it clearly, and so did Jeremy, who had crept forward just enough to catch the whispered warning. In the cockpit, the captain's voice returned to the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been cleared for an emergency descent. Please remain seated. Medical teams will be waiting upon arrival." Connor returned to the forward cabin, his face calm, his hands folded behind his back like a man returning from break. He stood silently by the curtain, his eyes locking briefly on Elijah's lifeless body. But Franklin was watching him now. So was Jeremy. The truth tried to escape, but barely made it out. The jet touched down with a shudder, wheels screeching against the tarmac of Eldridge County Regional Airport. The moment the aircraft slowed to a halt, the cabin burst into controlled chaos. Passengers craned their necks as paramedics stormed the narrow aisles, carrying stretchers and gear with practiced urgency. "Make room, please," one called out, his voice sharp and commanding. In seat 3A, Elijah Cross lay sprawled on the floor, his face pale and slick with sweat. Blood streaked from the corner of his mouth, now crusting at the edges. His breathing was shallow, barely audible above the rustling confusion of concerned murmurs. Two medics crouched beside him, quickly attaching oxygen tubes and checking vitals. One looked up and shook his head. "We need to move now," he said to the lead responder, who was already coordinating the stretcher's positioning. Franklin, the passenger from 3B, remained kneeling beside Elijah, his hands trembling from the shock of what he'd just witnessed. "He was reading his notes 1 second, Franklin said to no one in particular. Then, this. The metal latch of the cabin door groaned open, releasing a gust of warm, humid air. Outside, red and blue lights flickered across the tarmac, casting surreal shadows through the fuselage. As Elijah was gently transferred onto the stretcher, his hand twitched once, then fell limp again. Back near the galley, flight attendant Connor Vale stood quietly, watching the scene with unreadable eyes. His posture was calm, too calm, and his hands were folded behind his back. "What happened to him?" a marshal asked as he stepped on board, notebook in hand. Connor blinked slowly, then replied in a steady tone. "He asked for water. I gave it to him. That's all." The marshal nodded, moving down the aisle to begin questioning witnesses. Connor took a careful breath and turned toward the galley. The moment he stepped behind the curtain, his hands moved quickly. He grabbed a cloth from beneath the service counter and began wiping down the metal surfaces, trays, handles, water dispenser nozzles, every inch that might have a fingerprint. He kept his movements methodical but quick, glancing back at the curtain to make sure no one was watching. Across the cabin, Jeremy, the youngest of the flight crew, watched him from near the emergency exit. His brow furrowed, lips slightly parted. Something about Connor's calmness didn't sit right. He'd seen him earlier, palms damp, glancing over his shoulder repeatedly. Now, Connor moved with the precision of someone who wasn't confused, but someone cleaning up. Jeremy stepped quietly toward a nearby air marshal who was reviewing a statement from another passenger. Leaning in close, he whispered, "That guy." The one cleaning the galley. He was acting strange before it happened. The marshal's eyes narrowed. He didn't ask Jeremy to repeat himself. Instead, he turned, signaled to a colleague, and moved swiftly toward the galley. Connor was just finishing wiping down the inside panel of a storage drawer when the footsteps approached. He straightened, spun, and smiled faintly. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice smooth but a touch too casual. "Routine check," the marshal said. "Mind stepping out for a moment?" "Of course," Connor replied. "I was just getting things in order." "Can we see your uniform?" the marshal asked. "Jacket, shoes too." Connor hesitated. It was brief, no more than a second, but enough to raise suspicion. He started removing his jacket, then reluctantly bent to untie his shoes. As he pulled them off, the left sock bulged oddly around the ankle. The marshal pointed. "Take that off too." Connor's jaw tightened. "Is this really necessary?" The second marshal stepped in. "Sir, either you cooperate or we escalate." Connor's lips curled slightly in annoyance. With slow hands, he peeled down the sock and out-slipped a tiny glass vial, clinking softly against the rubber floor. Silence fell like a curtain. The marshal didn't hesitate. "You're under arrest for attempted murder," he said, pulling the cuffs from his belt and stepping forward. Connor stiffened. "You don't understand," he muttered through clenched teeth. "This is political. Bigger than you think." The marshal didn't blink. "Maybe," he said, "but it starts here." With hands secured behind his back, Connor was led down the aisle. Every passenger now turned to watch. Eyes followed him like searchlights. Franklin stood near the front, jaw slack, disbelief etched across his weathered face. Jeremy remained silent, shaken but resolute. The plane's engines ticked softly in the distance, the air filled with the low hum of radios and boots on metal. Elijah Cross was gone, rushed to critical care with no promise of survival. But justice, slow and deliberate, had made its first move. As Connor was escorted down the stairs into waiting custody, the passengers remained in stunned silence, their travel plans forgotten, their minds anchored to the scene unfolding before them. The sky outside was clear and wide, but for those aboard Flight 3702, the innocence of the journey had shattered. The cabin wasn't just a vessel anymore, it was a crime scene. Elijah was still unconscious, but the justice system had taken its first step. The skies were no longer friendly. Now they were witnesses. At Eldridge General Hospital, the emergency wing buzzed with tension. Paramedics rushed Elijah Cross through the double doors, his unconscious body pale, lips tinged blue and stained with blood. Monitors beeped erratically as nurses flanked the gurney, pushing it through sterile corridors lined with cold fluorescent lights. One medic barked, "BP's dropping, get the crash cart ready." Another already had oxygen over Elijah's face, his chest barely rising beneath the straps. As they rounded the corner into ICU, Dr. Lionel Garrison met them head-on, pulling on gloves. "What's the story?" he demanded. "Mid-air collapse, suspected poisoning, paralysis, pulse thready," a nurse fired back. Garrison's eyes narrowed. "Get him into room 4. Intubate. I want blood, tox panel, and full body scans immediately. Go." The door swung shut behind them. Hours passed before Elijah was stabilized. The results came back slowly, but one report snapped everyone to attention. A specialist from toxicology approached Dr. Garrison and handed him a sealed envelope. "It's Voltrex 7, the man said grimly. "Undetectable in standard panels. We only found it because of how the neuroinhibitors responded to treatment." Garrison's jaw tightened. "That's a military-grade paralytic. Who has access to something like that? I don't know, the specialist replied, but whoever used it didn't want him unconscious. They wanted him erased. Word of the attack spread fast. Outside the hospital, camera flashes lit the night as news vans lined the curb. Headlines blared across networks within hours. Black Tech CEO poisoned mid-flight. In the waiting area, Devin Rames stood grim and unspeaking, flanked by 2 corporate lawyers and a media advisor. His phone buzzed nonstop, calls from board members, investors, and journalists. He ignored most of them. His focus remained fixed on the hallway leading to Elijah's room. He's stable, a nurse finally told him, but he's not waking up. They've induced a coma to keep the swelling down. Devin exhaled, more like a growl than a breath. This wasn't an accident. We're treating it as attempted murder, a voice replied from behind him. Devin turned to find Detective Marcus Quill standing in a long gray coat, his eyes sharp and cold as steel. We've interviewed the flight crew. One of them, Connor Vale, is in custody. Devin's brow furrowed. Why would a flight attendant go that far? That's what I'm trying to figure out. Quill took a slow step forward, lowering his voice. But we found something that doesn't add up. A trace financial transaction, offshore deposit made under a false identity. The recipient is tied to someone your boss once worked with. Devin's mouth went dry. Who? Quill pulled a notepad from his pocket and read a name. A certain Darius Flint? Devin felt the name like a slap. Darius Flint had once been a rising star at Savantis, charismatic, calculated, and ruthless when needed. But 3 years ago, a merger gone wrong cost the company millions. Elijah had called for an internal audit, and when discrepancies surfaced, Darius was quietly dismissed. No press, no lawsuits, just a silent exit. Until now. You're saying Darius put a hit on Elijah? Devin asked, incredulous. I'm saying Connor Vale didn't do this alone, Quill said. And the kind of poison used? That's not something you buy off a street corner. This was planned, funded, delivered with intent. Devin turned toward the ICU wing. Through the glass he could see Elijah, unmoving, hooked up to machines that beeped steadily in a grim rhythm. Then we're not dealing with revenge, he murmured. We're dealing with strategy. Quill nodded. Exactly. Which means someone knew Elijah's flight plans. Someone with access. Devin straightened. I'll get our internal security team to review the company logs, see who had access to his itinerary in the last week. Good, Quill replied, his voice dropping to a warning tone. But be careful. If this was an inside job, they might not be done yet. Meanwhile, across town, in a high-rise apartment overlooking the city skyline, Connor Vale sat in a holding cell, arms crossed, face impassive. He hadn't said a word since the cuffs were locked. A second detective entered, slid a chair across the concrete floor, and dropped into it. You realize you could face life for this, the man said. Connor stared straight ahead. You poisoned a man mid-flight. That's not some bar fight or drunken mistake. That's federal, terrorism-level stuff. Still nothing. The detective sighed. Tell us who you were working with. Maybe we shave off some years. Connor finally turned his head. You don't get it, he said flatly. You think this was personal? Wasn't it? No. He smirked, bitter. This was business. Big business. Then who paid you? Connor's jaw tightened. I don't know his name. Just a number. Instructions came through a burner phone. Payment was promised after the job. Burner phone? The detective echoed. Check my locker, Connor muttered. You'll find it hidden behind the vent panel, still charged. Back at the precinct, detectives pried open the compartment in Connor's locker. Behind a loose ventilation grill nestled between a pair of insoles lay a prepaid phone. They powered it on. Only one outgoing call had ever been made, time-stamped just before Flight 3702's departure. The signal pinged off a tower in Vondale City. Detective Quill stared at the screen, eyes narrowing. Why call before takeoff? Devin's voice came over the phone, patched in remotely. Because someone was watching. They wanted to confirm he boarded. That means the puppet master was already in Vondale, Quill muttered. He wasn't running. He was waiting. Far from Eldridge, in a dimly lit study inside a secluded country lodge, a man watched the breaking news from a mounted television screen. Darius Flint leaned back in his leather chair, swirling a glass of deep red wine. His expression was unreadable, cold, distant, calm. A younger man entered, his coat damp from the rain. "Connor's been arrested," he reported. Darius barely reacted. He knew the risk. "There's talk of a federal investigation. It's on every network." Darius sipped. Let them talk. The young man hesitated. What if the police connect the dots? Darius finally looked at him, the ghost of a smile curling his lips. They will, eventually. He stood, moving to the window as lightning flared in the distance, casting his silhouette in flickering shadow. "But by the time they reach me," he murmured, "this game will already be in motion." Behind him, the screen showed an image of Elijah on a stretcher, blurred by camera flashes and scrolling headlines. "This wasn't personal revenge," Darius whispered. "It was a contract job, and the sky was only the beginning." Detective Marcus Quill leaned over the evidence board in his office, the dim overhead light casting long shadows across the grainy photographs and printed bank records. The numbers didn't lie. $150,000 wired into a Cayman account just 48 hours before Elijah Cross boarded Flight 3702. The name attached to the transaction stopped him cold. Darius Flint. Quill's jaw tightened. He remembered the name from a buried file, once a rising star at Savantis Dynamics, now a ghost. Quietly dismissed after a failed merger 3 years prior, Flint had vanished from the tech world without a trace. But now, his fingerprints were all over this. Quill turned to the junior analyst across the room. "Pull every internal memo regarding Flint's exit. I want full access logs, legal settlements, board minutes, everything they buried." The analyst nodded and rushed off. Quill sat back, staring at the bank document. The timing, the amount, the method, it all pointed to a well-funded, calculated hit. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, the scent of stale coffee lingering in the air. "He didn't just resurface," he muttered to himself. "He came back with a purpose." Meanwhile, in a secure holding room, Connor Vale sat cuffed to a metal table, eyes fixed on the wall. His face was blank, unreadable, like a man who knew he was no longer in control but still held a secret card. When Quill entered the room, Connor barely looked up. "I'm not here to play games," Quill said, pulling up a chair. "The man you poisoned is fighting for his life, and we've traced your payout." Connor finally turned, his smirk subtle but sharp. "Then you know I'm not the only one who wanted him gone." Quill didn't flinch. "Tell me about Darius Flint." Connor shook his head slowly, tapping his fingers once against the steel tabletop. "Never met him, never saw his face. Just a voice, distorted, instructions left on a burner, payment promised after the job. That's all I know." "You expect me to believe you risked murder for a ghost?" Connor's eyes narrowed. "I didn't risk anything. He said I'd be out before the dust settled. Said someone inside would delay any investigation long enough for me to disappear." Quill's eyes locked onto him. "Someone inside?" Connor said nothing more. Silence fell between them, thick and heavy. The detective stood slowly. "You're done here for now, but this doesn't end with you." Back at Savantis headquarters, Devin Rames was pacing. The boardroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as PR teams fielded relentless press calls and legal advisors reviewed statements. Devin's mind, however, was somewhere else entirely. He had just spoken with Quill. The possibility of an internal leak, someone within Savantis feeding Elijah's itinerary to an assassin, made his skin crawl. He pulled out his tablet and opened the encrypted logs of Elijah's travel schedule. Only 6 people had access. 4 were in that building. 1 was Elijah. The 6th, his eyes paused, had been Darius Flint. Devin's pulse quickened. Flint's access had supposedly been revoked years ago, but Devin now feared someone had restored it from within. He dialed Quill immediately. "Detective, I think we have a mole, and I think Flint planned this deeper than we assumed." Quill's voice crackled through the phone. "Send everything, and keep your eyes open. If Flint had access, he knew more than Elijah's flight path. He might know what's next." 2 hours away, nestled deep in a wooded clearing outside of Branmere, a country lodge glowed under the setting sun. Inside, Darius Flint reclined in a leather chair, a fire crackling nearby. The flickering flames danced across his face, revealing the calm poise of a man who felt entirely in control. On the flat-screen television mounted above the fireplace, a breaking news banner scrolled across the bottom. CEO Elijah Cross remains in critical condition, suspect in custody. Darius swirled the wine in his glass, his reflection dark in the crimson liquid. His lips curled into a satisfied smile. A man in a gray turtleneck stepped forward from the corner of the room. "Phase 1's complete, sir." Darius nodded. "And the fallout?" "Mixed. The company's stable for now. But they're rattled. The board's divided. Media's biting." Darius stood and walked to a nearby desk, where a thick folder waited. Inside were printed screenshots, emails, private logs, encrypted message trails. In the center was a black and white photo of Elijah Cross. "People like Elijah think resilience is enough," Darius murmured. "But resilience only works if the world plays fair. And I'm done playing fair." He pulled down a map of Savantis' regional headquarters from the wall. Red X's marked certain nodes, access points, data centers, digital locks. "You sure he won't wake up?" the man asked. Darius didn't answer at first. He stared at the screen again, at Elijah's face on the news. Then he said quietly, "Even if he does, he won't recognize the kingdom when he returns." He tapped one of the nodes on the map and whispered, "Let's see who fills the power vacuum." The boardroom erupted in shouts the moment the conference call ended. "This company can't survive in limbo," barked Wallace Trent, a senior board member with silver hair and a short fuse. "Our stock dipped 4 points overnight. Investors are spooked. We need leadership, stable leadership, and Elijah, God help him, is still unconscious." Devin Rames stood at the head of the long oak table, his tie loosened, jaw tense. "And replacing him now would hand our enemies exactly what they want. If you can't see that, you're playing into someone else's hands." Murmurs broke out across the board. Some nodded in agreement, others looked away. The air was hot with conflict, thick with the scent of tension and expensive cologne. Sunlight slanted through the tall windows of the Millston headquarters, but it did little to brighten the atmosphere. "Let's not pretend we're not vulnerable," muttered Alan Roke, the CFO, scrolling through his phone. "The media's running with this like wolves on raw meat. And now this." He tapped his screen and flung the image to the central monitor. An anonymous email had landed in every board member's inbox just minutes earlier. The subject line read, "Your CEO is the company's greatest liability." The room fell into stunned silence as the attachment loaded. A stack of internal memos, all supposedly signed by Elijah, outlining discussions with vendors on a federal watch list, illegal transactions, shadow accounts, a damning trail. Devin stepped forward, eyes narrowing. "That's not Elijah's formatting." He turned toward the screen, his voice now sharp and controlled. "These headers, this margin spacing, even the font choice, it's Darius. He used to format every memo like this before we terminated him." A hush spread. Several board members exchanged wary glances. Devin pulled out his phone and dialed. "Get Quill," he said. "Now." Detective Marcus Quill paced slowly through the small office attached to the boardroom, inspecting the email metadata. The hum of computers buzzed low behind him as the company's IT chief hovered nearby. "No traceable IP," Quill muttered. "Routed through 6 proxy servers in 3 countries." He turned to Devin, who stood by the window, arms crossed tightly. "But you're sure this is Flint's style?" "I'd bet my job on it," Devin said, his eyes fixed on the skyline. "He had a way of hiding knives inside compliments. These fakes are trying to look polished, but they're just messy enough to be believed." Quill nodded. "Then let's see if we can find the fingerprints he didn't mean to leave." At the detention facility downtown, Connor Vale sat hunched over a cold metal table, his fingers locked together. The once pristine uniform had been replaced by a gray jumpsuit, and his expression was a mask of exhaustion and resentment. A single fluorescent light flickered overhead, casting shadows across his hollowed face. Quill entered with measured steps, a folder tucked under one arm. He dropped it on the table with a thud. "Still planning to play the silent martyr?" he asked. Connor didn't respond. He stared ahead blankly. Quill circled slowly, pulling out a chair and sitting down. "Your brother," he began, sliding a photograph forward, "works as a junior baggage handler at a regional airport in Clearwater. Just got promoted. He's proud of you, told the press you were always the one who followed the rules." For the first time, Connor's jaw clenched. "We got word the airline's considering letting him go," Quill added. "Guilt by association. That doesn't seem fair, does it?" Connor's voice came out low, almost broken. "You leave him out of this." "Then give me something," Quill said, his tone quiet but firm. "Something to keep him out of it." Silence. Then, slowly, Connor inhaled through his nose and leaned forward. "I never met the man," he whispered, eyes darting toward the two-way glass. "Didn't know his name, but a locker on Deck C had a burner phone. My name was taped to the back. No number saved, just a text. Wait for call." Quill's eyes narrowed. "And you answered?" Connor nodded, his voice growing hoarse. It was modulated, machine-like. "Gave me instructions. Said the payment would post once I confirmed the job was done." Quill opened the folder, revealing the confiscated burner. "Our tech team's already on it. The SIM only connected once, right before takeoff." Connor didn't react. Quill leaned in. "It pinged from Vondale City." Connor looked up then, his lips parting slightly. "So, he was there? The whole time?" Quill stood, closing the folder. "The mastermind wasn't running. He was waiting for the results. He poisoned a black CEO, leaving him vomiting blood and slipping under, sure no one would notice. If you believe every act of cruelty must be answered, hit subscribe now. Justice starts here." Elijah's eyes snapped open, but the room remained a blur. The sterile white ceiling spun above him as a sharp ache crawled up his spine and throbbed behind his temples. Machines beeped steadily beside his bed, their rhythm oddly comforting, like a heartbeat he no longer trusted. Every breath came with effort, like pulling air through glass. Sweat clung to his skin, and the dull weight in his limbs told him something terrible had happened. A shadow shifted beside him. Devin Rames stood from the nearby chair, eyes wide with both relief and restraint. His hands trembled as he reached for the call button, then paused, as if fearing Elijah might vanish again. "Elijah," Devin said softly, his voice cracking from hours of silence. "Can you hear me?" Elijah blinked, his vision focusing slowly. Devin's face came into view, creased with worry, jaw clenched with something deeper than fear. "What happened?" Elijah asked, his voice dry and coarse like sandpaper. "You collapsed on the flight," Devin said, sitting down again. "There was something in the water, a paralytic compound. We nearly lost you." The words settled like stones in Elijah's chest. He swallowed, the motion slow and painful. "The water," he rasped. "It wasn't just bad, was it?" Devin hesitated. Then he nodded once, grimly. "It was poisoned. You were targeted." For a moment, neither spoke. The monitor beeped steadily, recording the storm beneath Elijah's quiet surface. His mind began stitching together broken memories. Connor's eyes, the strange taste, the pain. A knot formed in his throat, not from fear, but fury. "They want me erased," Elijah whispered, voice sharper now. "This wasn't random." Devin nodded again. "We know. The police are on it. Quill's been digging nonstop." Elijah's jaw tensed. He didn't need to ask who they were. He'd lived long enough at the top to know how far some men would go to drag you down. Across town, Detective Marcus Quill sat hunched over a cluttered desk inside the Vondale Police Cyber Division, eyes glued to grainy surveillance footage. The timestamp blinked, the morning before the flight. The footage showed a co-working booth entrance in a downtown building. A hooded man slipped inside, head down, face mostly hidden. Quill rewound the clip again, slower this time. He noticed the gait, the slight right lean in the walk, the uneven pace. His fingers danced over the keyboard, running a comparison through the analytics program. A match, 86% probability. Darius Flint. "Gotcha," Quill murmured, eyes narrowing. His pulse quickened. Minutes later, a SWAT team moved into position outside a remote country lodge nestled in the forest outskirts of Vondale. They moved with precision, boots crunching quietly against gravel, radios hushed. Quill rode in with the lead vehicle, weapon holstered but hand near it. He wasn't taking chances. They breached the lodge just past dusk. The air inside was stale, tinged with burnt coffee and something faintly metallic. It was empty, but not abandoned. What they found chilled Quill more than if they had walked into an armed ambush. A whiteboard dominated the far wall. It was covered in photographs, mostly of Savantis executives. Colored lines connected faces to dates, security codes, addresses. Some photos were taken from a distance, others clearly lifted from internal systems. But at the center of it all, circled twice in thick red marker, was one image that made Quill's stomach twist. Elijah Cross. The photo wasn't just from a media site, it was a live feed still from the hospital. Below it, scribbled in capital letters, Room 214, no more chances. Quill stepped back, breath caught in his throat. "He's not done," he said under his breath. "He's planning something else." A junior officer stepped forward. "Sir, there's a receipt on the desk. Delivery drop, encrypted router parts, delivered yesterday." "Flint's building something," Quill muttered. "Or someone else is, and he's getting bolder." Outside, the wind picked up, rustling through the pine trees as dusk deepened into night. The agents moved swiftly, collecting devices, documents, everything that might offer a clue. Back at the hospital, Elijah struggled to sit up, ignoring the stabbing ache in his ribs. "I need to speak with Quill. Now," he told Devon, who placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Take it slow, man. You just woke up." Elijah's eyes, though sunken and bloodshot, burned with clarity. "They already failed once. That means they won't hesitate to try again." Devon nodded grimly. "Security's being increased, guards on every entrance." But Elijah wasn't comforted. He could feel it in his bones. This wasn't over. Someone was moving in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Miles away, in the shadows of a low-lit office, Darius Flint leaned forward, fingers tapping on a digital blueprint glowing across his laptop. Around him, a group of men stood in silence. One adjusted a holstered weapon, another scrolled through access logs on a tablet. A man in a pressed black jacket stepped forward. "Elijah's awake." Flint's expression didn't shift. Only his fingers stilled. A second passed. Then he leaned back, eyes narrowing. "We missed the mark," the man added. Flint finally spoke, voice cool and firm. "Then it's time for Phase 2. He rotated the screen. A blueprint of Cervantes' cloud server filled the display. "If we can't kill the man," Flint said, eyes hardening, "we'll destroy the kingdom." Back at the lodge, Quill stood frozen in front of the whiteboard, one hand tightening into a fist. "This wasn't over," he whispered. "They're going to finish what they started." The hallway outside Elijah Cross's hospital room buzzed with tension. Two armed security officers stood at opposite ends, eyes scanning every movement, fingers resting near their sidearms. A third guard checked IDs before allowing anyone to approach. The sterile air felt tighter than usual, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Inside the room, Elijah stirred beneath thin white sheets, the soft beep of monitors syncing with the slow rise and fall of his chest. Sunlight filtered through the window blinds, striping his face with fading gold as afternoon gave way to evening. Devon Rames, Cervantes' interim leader and Elijah's most trusted ally, stood at the bedside, tablet in hand, quietly issuing instructions to a team of legal and cybersecurity consultants stationed at a hotel across the street. Elijah's eyes fluttered open again, his fifth time that hour, but this time they didn't close. His gaze sharpened. He inhaled slowly, as though drawing strength from the air itself. Devon leaned forward. "You need anything?" Devon asked, voice hushed but firm. Elijah blinked, then swallowed. "Water. Not poisoned." Devon managed a dry smile and passed him a sealed bottle himself. "Double-checked?" Elijah drank, then wiped his mouth with the back of his trembling hand. His eyes turned distant, thoughtful. "I keep seeing it." His eyes? Devon furrowed his brow. "Connor?" Elijah nodded. "When he handed me the drink, he wasn't angry. He wasn't smug. It was like he wasn't even there." He paused, his voice thin but certain. "I didn't see hate. I saw duty, like he was following orders." Devon sat back slowly, the words weighing heavy in the room. "Then we know this wasn't just revenge. It was bigger." Across the city, beneath a sleek gray building with no signage, a man named Darius Flint walked calmly through a reinforced glass door. The security camera blinked as it scanned his forged ID, then clicked green. He passed without incident. Darius was dressed sharp, black wool coat, dark slacks, gloves in hand, but it was the stillness in his expression that stood out. Not triumphant, not worried, calculated. He descended a narrow metal staircase, then stepped through a second door into a dim, underground conference room, humming with low light and colder intentions. The space was functional. Steel walls, recessed lights, and a long matte black table surrounded by 5 men. They said nothing as he entered. At the head of the table sat Mason Red, a lean man with thinning blonde hair and a deliberate stillness in every move he made. In front of him was a closed laptop. "He's awake," Mason said, tapping the device once. Darius's jaw shifted. "Vitals confirmed?" Mason nodded. "Doctors reduced sedation this morning. He's responsive." For a moment, Darius didn't speak. He walked over to the far wall where a single monitor displayed muted news footage of Elijah's condition. The headline scrolled across the bottom of the screen. "Cervantes, CEO in recovery after suspected in-flight poisoning." "We missed the mark," Mason added, tone steady. Darius inhaled slowly. "Then it's time for Phase 2. He stepped forward and opened the laptop with a soft click. The screen lit up with a blueprint, an intricate schematic of Cervantes's internal cloud infrastructure, webbed with connection points, data paths, and vulnerabilities. One blinking node pulsed in red. "If we can't kill the man," Darius said, voice low and controlled, "we'll destroy the kingdom." At exactly midnight, Cervantes Dynamics was thrown into chaos. Without warning, the company's global server grid lit up with red alerts. Phantom traffic surged through every access point like a digital flood. Fake login attempts multiplied by the second. Admin dashboards flashed with urgent warnings: data breach in progress, unauthorized access detected, malware deployment detected. In the Network Operations Center, technicians scrambled from station to station. Screens flickered, systems blinked, firewalls strained under the weight of the invisible siege. Panic rippled through the corridors like a live current. Miles away, in his hospital bed, Elijah Cross stirred from a shallow sleep. The beeping of a nearby monitor echoed steadily, measuring each fragile breath. A nurse had just adjusted his IV drip when Devin Rames burst into the room, phone in hand, voice tight with alarm. "Elijah," Devin said, barely containing his urgency. "They've hit us. Servers, files, everything. It's coordinated." Elijah blinked through the haze of medication, forcing his mind into focus. "The system?" he asked. "Being overrun," Devin replied. "It's not random. It's targeted, strategic. The cybersecurity team's holding the line, but legacy vulnerabilities. They're getting in." Elijah sat up slowly, pain seeping through his torso. "Patch me into the board," he said, his voice firm. Devin hesitated. "You can barely sit upright." Elijah's hand gripped the bed rail. His jaw set. "They're betting I'm weak. Let's show them what a recovery looks like." Minutes later, a secure video line opened. The board members' faces appeared in a grid across the hospital monitor. Some looked rattled. Others were already bracing for disaster. "Mr. Cross," one of them began, "we're under digital siege. We've already lost 2 client sectors. Some financial models have been corrupted beyond rollback. If this continues—" "It won't," Elijah interrupted, his voice a low, steady current. "This is a breach built from inside. Gaps in our system left during earlier builds, deliberately left, I believe, are now being used against us." The air in the call grew heavier. No one disputed his claim. "Darius," murmured board member Nathan Corrin. "It's him. He knew those back doors." Elijah nodded. "He's weaponizing our own foundation, but he doesn't know what Devin and I built after he left." Devin stepped into frame. "The beta cloud, closed circuit, reinforced with decentralized shielding." "That system is isolated," Elijah continued. "Only Devin and I have clearance. We move now, shut down the legacy servers, migrate to the beta core. We'll lose uptime, but not the company." "But," another director began, hesitating. "Shutting down the legacy framework means losing decades of data configurations." Elijah's voice cut through the tension. "We've already lost more in minutes. Every second we wait, he owns more of our identity. This is our firewall, not just against data loss, but against sabotage." For a beat, there was silence. Then, one by one, the directors nodded. The vote passed unanimously. Devin took the reins immediately, issuing rapid-fire instructions to the tech teams. Emergency shutdown protocols initiated. Redundant systems blinked offline. A silent countdown began for the servers to reboot from the isolated beta cloud. At the same moment, far from Millston, in a candlelit operations room, Darius Flint stood before a row of monitors, watching the chaos he had unleashed. Code poured down the screens like a waterfall of language only he could read. Data pathways flickered. Systems trembled under pressure. He waited for the final breach, an indicator that the company's internal HR archive had collapsed. That was the prize. That was the fall. Instead, one screen went black. Then another. And another. "What is this?" he snapped, stepping forward. Reboot? He turned toward his tech lead, a silent man in a gray hoodie. Tell me it's a bluff. The tech shook his head. It's clean architecture, not legacy. They've shifted to something else, completely separate. We can't breach it. Darius clenched his fists. He was supposed to fall, he hissed. He wasn't supposed to fight back. Darius Flint moved through the hangar with practiced ease, his leather shoes clicking lightly against the polished concrete floor. The private terminal was dimly lit, mostly quiet at this hour of the night, save for the distant hum of jet engines and the low chatter of a refueling crew. The Gulfstream sat on the far end of the tarmac, its stairway lowered, cabin lights glowing faintly like a promise of freedom. Darius adjusted the collar of his trench coat, a sleek black duffel hanging from his shoulder, and kept his gaze straight ahead. Each step toward the plane felt heavier than the last. Inside his coat pocket was a forged passport under the name Luther Vance, complete with federal clearance codes lifted from an old contact he'd once helped through a data breach. The pilot, already seated and prepped, gave a simple nod from the window, just as rehearsed. Everything was in motion. Everything was ready. But Darius had made a mistake. He hadn't accounted for the redundancy of the government tech liaison Elijah had brought in. While he was launching one final exploit into Cervantes' HR core, a backdoor vulnerability triggered by accessing archived employee vetting logs, Elijah's team had quietly run a separate sweep, the kind used for high-risk defense contractors. Not only had they neutralized the breach before it could detonate, they had traced the hidden access codes which led straight back to Darius's old credentials. At that very moment, in a federal building across town, Detective Marcus Quill leaned over a desk with headphones on, listening to an old voicemail that had never been deleted, only buried deep within a former employee's inbox. "If I can't sit in his chair," Darius's voice seethed through the static, "I'll set the whole thing on fire." Quill removed the headphones slowly, the weight of the words pressing into his chest. He turned to the federal agent beside him and said, "That's our warrant." Back at the tarmac, Darius climbed the metal stairs with silent confidence. The night air was crisp. The moon, partially veiled by drifting clouds, cast silver shadows across the aircraft's wings. As he reached the top step, a sliver of something cold prickled the back of his neck. Instinct told him to move faster, but pride made him pause. One last look at the skyline. One last moment of imagined triumph. Then the floodlights snapped on. A chorus of engines roared from the far end of the airstrip. Unmarked SUVs surged forward in a tight formation. Red and blue lights exploded into the darkness, painting the plane in bursts of urgency. The pilot, startled, threw his hands into the air as a voice boomed over a loudspeaker. "Federal agents, shut down the engine. Step away from the aircraft." Darius froze. Below him, agents poured from vehicles like a precision unit, rifles raised, bodies moving with swift mechanical efficiency. The plane's engine died mid-whine. The door behind him hissed open. Darius didn't move. His fingers tightened around the rail. He had always been the one pulling strings, controlling the narrative, the room, the exit. This was not part of the script. A man in tactical gear approached first, his voice sharp and measured. "Darius Flint, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, cyber-terrorism, and corporate sabotage. Step down from the aircraft. Slowly." Darius did not resist. With a quiet breath, he stepped back onto the stairs, descended one step at a time. He moved with grace, not defiance, head high, shoulders straight, like a man giving a speech no one could interrupt. When his polished shoes met the tarmac, a circle of agents closed in. He reached into his coat slowly, pulled out the forged passport, and handed it over without a word. The agent inspected it, nodded to another, and gestured toward the waiting van. "You knew I wouldn't make it, didn't you?" Darius asked, his voice low but steady. "You waited until the end. Very theatrical." One of the agents didn't reply. Another clipped the cuffs on with practiced precision. Darius looked toward the now motionless aircraft. The stars above were indifferent. The escape plan, the months of coordination, the layers of betrayal, burned away in one clean moment. The final hand he played had failed, but he still held on to the illusion of dignity. As they guided him toward the van, the engines of the federal vehicles purred in unison. The private jet lights flickered, then dimmed completely. A silence settled around them, cold and absolute. Darius turned his head just enough to catch the shadow of the plane's wing across the asphalt. He smiled faintly. "Guess the sky doesn't belong to me anymore." The courtroom was silent as Connor Vale stepped onto the witness stand. The murmur of the gallery had faded to an eerie stillness, the kind that felt heavier than noise. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but the world was still watching. Reporters filled every available seat, pens hovering, recording each shift in body language and every stammered word. Connor's hands were cuffed, the orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to the navy blue suit Elijah Cross wore as he sat just 20 feet away, back straight, gaze unshaken. Connor's face was pale, thinner than before, eyes sunken from weeks in a holding cell. He avoided Elijah's eyes as he took the oath, his voice barely above a whisper. "I swear to tell the truth." The prosecutor, Roland Mace, approached calmly. "Mr. Vale, in your own words, tell the court how you became involved in the plot against Elijah Cross." Connor hesitated. His fingers fidgeted with the edge of the wooden stand. "It started 3 weeks before the flight," he said, eyes flicking to the jury before dropping back to his lap. "A package came to my apartment, no return address. Inside was a phone, instructions, and a warning not to speak of it to anyone. Was it signed? Number. But the voice that later spoke to me on the phone, digitally altered, knew things. About me, about my cousin, about how much I owed." Mace nodded, prompting him gently. "What were you asked to do?" Connor swallowed. "To deliver a specific bottle of water to Mr. Cross on Flight 3702. That was it. Just that. I didn't ask what was in it. I was told it would look like a seizure, that it'd be chalked up to natural causes. The money was promised after the job was done." "Did you know who was behind the call?" Number not at first. "But you later learned?" Connor hesitated again. "Yes, it was Darius Flint." A wave rippled through the gallery. Elijah didn't flinch. "Why did you accept the deal?" Connor's voice cracked. "Because I was desperate. Because I didn't think I had a way out. And because I was told, if I didn't follow orders, someone in my family would disappear." "Did you receive payment?" Connor shook his head. "Not the full amount, just enough to keep me on the line. The rest was supposed to come after Elijah died." Silence again. Then Mace turned toward the jury, nodding once before stepping back. The defense declined to cross-examine. The damage had been done. Later that day, it was Darius Flint's turn to face judgment. He remained stone-faced throughout the trial, hands folded in front of him, suit crisp despite the circumstances. He never looked at Elijah, never once acknowledged the man he had tried to erase. Elijah watched from the front row, seated beside his legal advisor. He walked into the courtroom with a measured limp, the lasting damage from the poisoning still healing beneath his tailored suit. Though his body was not yet whole, his presence was undeniable. There was no fragility in his expression, only resolve. When he took the stand, the courtroom seemed to lean in. "I'm here," Elijah began, voice steady. "Not because I survived, but because I refused to let my story end at 30,000 feet. He paused, letting the words land. "I want the world to understand something," he continued. "This wasn't just an attack on me. It was an attack on what I represent, on any man who builds his future on honesty, discipline, and merit. Darius Flint failed in business, not because of sabotage, but because of his own greed. I didn't climb to the top by stepping on others. I climbed because I earned it." The judge asked him to clarify the impact. Elijah's response was simple. "My company nearly collapsed. My life was nearly lost. But what they didn't realize is that integrity builds more than businesses. It builds people who fight back." He returned to his seat to quiet applause from the gallery, quickly silenced by the gavel. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the atmosphere crackled with tension. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Darius Flint, guilty on all counts," the foreman read. "Conspiracy to commit murder, corporate sabotage, multiple counts of cybercrime." Darius did not react. His face remained impassive, as if he had already accepted the outcome. Connor Vale, under his plea deal, received 12 years. Darius Flint was sentenced to 25. Elijah didn't look at them as the sentencing was read. His eyes were fixed on the exit sign glowing above the courtroom doors. His breath was slow, even. Not triumphant, but resolved, because this wasn't just an ending, it was the start of something new. The crowd's applause thundered through the glass-paneled atrium of the Capitol Vale Tech Convention Center as the Savantis Dynamics logo pulsed across a massive curved screen. The air buzzed with anticipation, the energy of innovation and resilience woven into every corner of the sleek, modern venue. Cameras flashed, drones hovered silently, capturing the moment from above as industry leaders, reporters, and government delegates filled the auditorium. It was not just a product launch, it was a declaration of survival. Elijah Cross stepped onto the stage under a halo of light, his silhouette commanding and composed. The tailored navy suit fit him like armor, crisp and deliberate, much like the man himself. Though he walked without a cane now, the faint stiffness in his step whispered of battles not fully healed. The moment his face appeared on the main screen, the applause swelled again, this time not just for the company, but for the man who had defied death and betrayal. He paused at center stage, letting the claps settle, his gaze sweeping the crowd. His expression was firm, but not hardened. There was strength in his posture, sharpened by what he'd endured, and a measured calm in his voice when he finally spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a new era." The words echoed through the chamber, magnified by sound and silence alike. He glanced to the side of the stage where Devin Rames waited, hands clasped, chin slightly raised. Elijah continued, his voice smooth and steady. "Today, we unveil Vigilus, a platform designed not just to protect data, but to protect people. Whistleblowers, watchdogs, those who stand up when it's easier to stay silent." The screen behind him shifted to a pulsing interface, real-time data visualizations, breach simulations, and anomaly maps illuminating the digital battlefield Vigilus was built to guard. "When our walls are breached from the inside," Elijah went on, eyes locked with his audience, "our greatest defense is integrity. This isn't just cybersecurity, it's legacy security." There was a short, reverent silence before he turned slightly and extended a hand toward Devin. "And now, it's my honor to introduce the man who helped me hold the line when everything we built was under fire. The new Chief Operating Officer of Savantis Dynamics, Devin Rames." As Devin stepped forward, the auditorium erupted in applause. He gripped Elijah's hand firmly, then leaned in close, murmuring just loud enough for only Elijah to hear. "We made it." Elijah nodded once, but his eyes did not betray ease. Even in triumph, the memory of what had nearly been lost lingered behind his composed gaze. As Devin began his keynote, Elijah walked slowly off stage and entered a quieter back corridor. Security personnel nodded as he passed, but he didn't acknowledge them. His mind was elsewhere, half in the present, half in the shadows of what had unfolded months before. Every smile in the crowd had been hard-earned. Every cheer, a pushback against a past that still watched him from the corners. In a holding room behind the stage, a television mounted on the wall played a live news segment covering the summit. Across the country, people were watching, listening, but one man watched in silence behind a thick wall of reinforced glass. Inside a federal prison in Valahurst, Darius Flint sat at a metal table, arms folded, expression unreadable. The muted glow of the prison TV flickered over his face, casting sharp shadows beneath his cheekbones. Around him, the recreational room buzzed with noise, guards talking, inmates laughing at something on another screen, but Darius heard none of it. His focus was fixed. On the screen, Elijah's voice carried across the distance. "We don't just build software, we protect legacies." Darius's jaw twitched. He reached for a paper cup of lukewarm coffee but paused mid-motion, fingers tightening. He scoffed, quiet, bitter, short-lived. The plan had failed. The man he'd wanted to erase now stood stronger, more respected, more visible than ever. His attempts to poison the future had only fertilized it. Still staring at the screen, Darius leaned back slowly, the hard plastic chair creaking beneath him. No words left his lips, but inside, the cold weight of failure pressed deeper. He had orchestrated everything, the poison, the breach, the manipulation. And yet, here he was, trapped in steel and stone, watching the empire he tried to topple rise higher in his absence. Across the city, as the summit wrapped and the crowd began to exit, Elijah remained in the wings, speaking quietly with Devin and the development leads. The energy was hopeful, almost electric, but even in this moment of victory, a small voice inside him reminded, success had made him a target once, it could again. Still, his resolve didn't waver. His voice had grown louder, not quieter, and he would never let it be silenced again. Sometimes, a poison meant to silence you only strengthens your voice. The jet's cabin hummed softly as it ascended into the stratosphere. the city lights below fading into a sea of darkness. Elijah Cross leaned back in his leather seat, eyes fixed on the clouds beyond the window. His reflection stared back at him, steady, composed, but slightly changed. A fine scar traced just above his left collarbone, barely visible beneath the open collar of his shirt. He adjusted it absent-mindedly, as if trying to tuck away the memory that came with it. Across from him, Devin Rames reached into the chilled compartment beside his seat and pulled out 2 glass bottles of water. The condensation ran down his fingers as he held one up with a grin. "Clean this time?" he asked, arching an eyebrow. Elijah turned, lips twitching into a dry smile. He tapped his own bottle against Devin's. "Only one way to find out." Their chuckle was brief but sincere, echoing quietly in the cabin. The trust between them had only deepened since the trial. But even now, in the safety of a private jet manned by background-checked crew, Elijah couldn't help but glance once at the steward moving past them with a tray of snacks. His eyes lingered for a beat too long. Devin noticed. "You still don't trust the skies," Devin said softly, lowering his bottle without taking a sip. Elijah didn't deny it. "Not the skies," he replied, voice low and even. "People." There was a silence between them, not awkward, just heavy with history. Devin sat forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You've built something unshakable, Elijah. But it's not just code and contracts anymore. It's your name, your face. They tried to take that down." "And I didn't let them," Elijah said firmly, then paused. "But I can't pretend it didn't change me." The plane leveled and the seatbelt sign flicked off with a muted chime. Elijah unscrewed the bottle cap and took a long sip, the cool water sliding down his throat like a quiet declaration of defiance. Each drop reminded him that he'd survived what was meant to silence him. He reached for his briefcase and pulled out a leather folder, sliding it onto the table between them. Inside was the finalized charter of the Cross Foundation, an initiative he'd quietly developed in the months after the trial, funded partially by the settlement from Halvex Airlines and partially by silent contributions from allies across the tech sector. The Foundation's mission was simple: protect minority executives from sabotage, corporate suppression, and institutional neglect. Devin flipped through the pages, his brow rising with each detail. Legal Defense Fund, Executive Protection, Whistleblower Grants. He looked up. "You thought of everything." Elijah's voice was calm but resolute. "Because I lived through everything." As the conversation settled, the steward returned, setting down a tray of fruit and 2 cups of black coffee. Elijah nodded his thanks. This time, he watched the man's hands with care, noting every motion, not out of paranoia, but out of learned caution. He had no illusions left. Trust was earned, and vigilance was no longer optional. A subtle vibration came from Devin's tablet. He glanced down. "Savantis stock just hit a new high," he said, then chuckled. "You realize that the more they tried to bring you down, the more the world decided to lift you up." Elijah leaned back, eyes tracing the interior of the jet. "That's the part they never understand. Attacks only strengthen people who were built from the ground up." Devin raised his coffee in salute. "To never falling." Elijah raised his as well, clinking it gently. "To standing back up when you do." The jet banked slightly, revealing a break in the clouds. The sky stretched endlessly ahead, clear, vast, and quiet. In that moment, Elijah felt the pull of the past recede, like a storm finally retreating beyond the horizon. It hadn't broken him. If anything, it had shaped him into something sharper. He opened his laptop and pulled up the first proposal under the Cross Foundation's review, a case file involving a junior executive being pushed out for uncovering financial fraud. Elijah's fingers moved across the keyboard with confidence, issuing a directive to the legal team assigned. No more silence. Not on his watch. The steward passed by again, offering a nod. This time, Elijah nodded back. The cabin light dimmed slightly, casting a warm glow across the space. Devin reclined and looked toward the ceiling, then over at Elijah. "You sure you're ready to keep flying?" Elijah didn't hesitate. "I never stopped." Though the scars remained, some physical, others hidden, Elijah refused to live in fear. He used the settlement from the airline to establish the Cross Foundation, dedicated to protecting minority executives from corporate sabotage and providing legal defense against systemic sabotage. In the end, the skies belonged to him again, not because he took them back by force, but because he refused to let them be stolen. They tried to bury me in silence, but I climbed out with a louder truth. He tried to end a life at 30,000 feet. Minutes later, cuffs clicked over his wrists. If you stand for protecting the innocent and punishing the guilty, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It sheds light on themes of betrayal, racism, abuse of trust, and the dangers of unchecked prejudice. Its purpose is to provoke thought about systemic discrimination, raise awareness about hidden dangers in everyday interactions, and inspire conversations on accountability and justice.